Dr. Mitzi Smith. For those of you who don't know, I am the host, and I am also the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Our purpose in these dialogues is to bridge the insights of scholars and practitioners, especially those African-American and those of color, with people in our community. And this seemed to be a good space in which to do that. In her book, Sisters of the Yam, Bell Hooks states that wellness and self-care are political acts of resistance, and we might add creative resistance, and particularly for a people not meant to survive, as Audre Lorde has stated. So how do we survive? And we can't say that word, I don't think, without recognizing that many do not survive and are grieving as we speak. But those of us who are among the living, how do we survive? How do we do self-care in a world in which a dominant white constructed systems of oppression do not mean, or we're not built for us to survive, and certainly not to thrive, and particularly in this pandemic in which we find ourselves. So our panelists this evening are Dr. Monica Coleman. She's the professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. She's an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and author of, among other publications, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith. The other book that I'm mentioning is Making a Way Out of No Way, A Womanist Theology. And she also is the author of the Diner Project, as well as other publications. And Dr. LaConyer Davis, ABD, Doctorate in Education, LPC, NCC, CADC. This lady's doing some counseling. She is also a lecturer. She works, I believe she told me she works in the, we met in Instagram, that she works in the, which I wasn't aware of at the time, in the emergency room, I believe, in a Chicago hospital. She is also a lecturer at Chicago State University, and of course, a licensed professional counselor. Dr. Sherry Molock is associate professor in the Department of Psychology at George Washington University and pastor of the beloved Community Church in Accokeek, Maryland. And I have to say this about Dr. Molock. She was Dr. Molock when we attended Howard together in the MDiv program. And when I did not get accepted in the 3 programs I applied to my first year, she was one of those women who said to me, "You must apply again." And I remember your words. She said, "It's very political. You must apply again." And so I would not be here without your encouragement and others' encouragement, insisting that I apply again. Dr. Mindy McGarrah, my colleague, wonderful colleague and ally at Columbia Theological Seminary, is Associate Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care. She's also the Director of the MAT program at Columbia. She is author of Creating Resistances, Pastoral Care in a Post-Colonial World, as well as her, I think this is her newest, maybe that was her newest book, Misunderstanding Stories Towards a Post-Colonial Pastoral Theology, as well as other publications. Dr. Helena Choi Soholm, we were together at Harvard for a period. I believe I was in the doctorate program, she was in the master's program. She said I was her TA at one time. Yeah, those weren't the best years. But anyway, so she has a doctorate in clinical psychology. She's a psychotherapist and a Korean shaman practicing in Seattle. Her interests include contemporary forms of shamanism, ancestral work, and cultural identity, spirituality, and the arts. So each of our guests will present from 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will open it up for question and answers, and we will begin with Dr. Coleman.
I wanted to begin the conversation with a couple things that I think are radical, since we're talking about self-care and caring for our mental health as radical acts. And part of this is in keeping with the format of what you've been doing, Dr. Smith, and that is as a womanist, right? It's still radical to center Black women's religious experiences when we think about how we think about our faith. And so, I mean, this is part of what Bell Hooks is saying, part of what Audre Lorde is saying, what all womanists are saying is that, you know, we're putting our experiences first. We're putting our experiences at the center. And anyone who's been through higher education can tell you that is still a radical thing to do, to say that we deserve to be first and not last. And that is radical in our education, it's radical in our scholarship, and it is radical in our homes. I think that Black women, like most women, are socialized to take care of everybody else first, right? No matter how, and I can speak for myself at least, you know, feminist my education, no matter how radical my politics, no matter how progressive my parents and my rearing, it's still a default position because the many, many messages we receive from society, right? It's like the water we're swimming in many ways. And so to say that our experiences are first or are central or the starting place for anything is still a radical act. And I think it's a daily radical act. Like we have to we start in the center, right? If you move to the center, you look up, wait, we're back at the margins. You have to come back to the center again and say, wait a minute. And so I know this is true for myself, particularly as someone who is a caregiver. It is very easy to care for the elders in my life, the young people in my life, and then be like, wait a minute, what about me? How did I get to the bottom of the list? This is not okay, right? And it happens so easily, I think, for me. I can say again, for myself, and so quickly. And so one, I want to say that deciding to put ourselves at the center, starting with our experiences, is radical. The second thing I wanted to talk about as radical is coming as a theologian, and that is the word grace. And it's used so often in Protestant Christianity that I think we forget how radical it is. Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace, like we can't just go giving this out all over the place. That dilutes it. It loses its power when we think about grace as something like, oh, we'll easily forgive somebody without repentance, without apology, without, right, these different kinds of things. And he was speaking on a societal, right, and systemic level. But grace is this amazing, great notion that God comes to us. That's it, right? I mean, I think there are tons of books written about grace, but it's as simple as God comes to us. God is in us. It is incarnation, and it is letting ourselves off the hook in many ways. And so to me, grace is a really important concept when we think about our self-care and we think about our mental well-being, because when we offer ourselves grace, when we stop having the super high expectations for ourselves, that's God coming to us. That's us welcoming God in. It's, you know, that exhale, right? And that is also a radical act. I mean, this is so much of what Christianity is trying to share with us, and what so many religions are saying is that God comes to us, right? God is not so super far away, but is right here with us, and offering so much of divine power, for lack of a better word, to us in every moment. And so that's, I guess, the second radical concept I wanted to talk about. The third, perhaps less radical, is more popular, I would say, concept, or becoming more popular concept, is remembering that just our situatedness, is that a word? Sure it is, our situatedness as people who were not meant to survive means that we're not starting at zero when it comes to our well-being and our mental wellness, right? That we carry the traumas of our ancestors with us, right? Whether that's the ancestors of our generation before or many generations before, right? We carry the traumas of those who have been torn from their homeland. We carry the traumas of slavery and poverty and war. And this is much what I wrote about in Bipolar Faith, that it's not this kind of, let's look at some symptoms and check them off and give you a diagnosis, right? That our lives are more complex than that. And that we carry this with us. And so part of what's radical is acknowledging that, right? Is saying that it's not just like, oh, I had a bad day today. We're carrying these things in our genes, in our souls. I mean, I think this is what you saw the Hebrew Bible writers getting at when they talked about generational curses. That's not a language I would use, but I think that was the language they had from their worldview to express this way in which sometimes we carry with us some of the traumas of the past. And they also talk about generational blessedness, right? And they talk about how this can be interrupted. And that's the next radical act, right? That we carry this with us, but we also have these amazing set of tools, many of which I think are spiritual and cultural, that can help us, right? To alleviate and to release that trauma. I'm sure some of the psychologists will talk more about this, but speaking as a theologian and someone who thinks about spiritual practices, you know, that's how we know that we can like change our brain patterns through meditation. So there are now all these neuroscience studies that have said what religions have said for generations. Pray, people, sit still, listen to God, have community, dance it out, right? We have been saying this in religions for eons. And now the last 10, 20, 30 years, some scientists said, yeah, look, it works. We're like, yeah, we know. We have spirituals, we have community mourning, we have these rituals. So I say this as a backdrop to, if we're beginning with these things, with how radical it is to put ourselves first, which is hard, how radical it is to welcome God into every moment of our lives, and meaning we don't have to do all the things, and how radical it is to remember that we're already starting a couple steps behind in some ways in terms of what we're bringing with us. The pandemic comes on top of that, right? So everybody's a little depressed. Everybody is more isolated than human beings are meant to be, right? Everybody has this huge disruption of their lives. And so, as it turns out, most people don't manage that kind of stress well. I don't know who does, right? And we have to call on all the tools that we have, because whatever we had before is now taken up 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 notches. And for many of us, we have grief compounded upon that because we've lost people suddenly. We have, or we're 1 degree from someone who has been lost suddenly. And it's grief, but it's also the inability to carry out the rituals that we have to manage grief. It's not that people don't die. People die. We know this. It's that we can't send them home. We can't celebrate them. We can't do all the things that we know spiritually, culturally, religiously, and psychologically help us, right, to manage grief and to manage loss. So I would say in this time and space where many of us are still sheltering at home, we're not able to do the things that we are used to doing, that some of us need to do, the best thing we can do is offer ourselves that grace. And to say, we don't have to get it all done. We don't have to do all the things. There are so many messages out here about being uber productive and starting new projects and writing your memoir. And, you know, if you just make it through the day, you've done well. You know, if you have connected with other people outside of a work necessity, you've done well. You know, if you found 10 minutes for a cup of tea, like this is my go-to self-care. It's like everybody's asleep. I have a cup of tea. No one's talking. 10 minutes. If that's all I get, right? That's the thing, right? It's just taking seeing every one of these small steps as radical acts of self-care, saying, you know what, we're ditching remote learning today. We're going to go for a walk. We're going to go climb a tree in the backyard. We're going to put a puzzle together, and everybody will still be, literate tomorrow, right? That all these different acts of paying attention to our own experiences and what we need and who we are before God, right? To me, that is where I would really think about self-care and our mental wellness in terms of what all of us can access, in this season.
Yes. Thank you so much. Very powerful in that show. Thank you so much. Yes, grace, putting ourselves at the center, situatedness, all radical. Yes. Doctor, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Coleman. Now, Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis.
Hello, everyone. Okay, I guess to piggyback off of Dr. Coleman, definitely I agree that, self-care is a radical act that a lot of people aren't used to, especially when it concerns people of color. I want to start with the American Counseling Association's codes of ethics. One of their codes of ethics is counselor self-care. It is an ethical concern of any organization, any agency that employs counselors or healers, healers of the arts of that such, that they are taking care of themselves. It's like a trickle-down effect. So, for example, I work at the emergency room in Stroger Hospital. It's a public hospital in Chicago, and pretty much everyone comes there. It's a pretty big city. Aside from the pandemic, we are already dealing with gun violence here. So, we have gun violence, and then on top of the gun violence, we now have the pandemic. So in order for me to do my job, because I work as a crisis therapist, I have to take care of myself. I have to be grounded. I meet people in crisis, and I'm a first responder. So I'm the first face that they encounter. And if I'm in an uproar, and if I'm in a panic state, and if I'm not at a peaceful equilibrium, it can exacerbate their symptoms. So one, definitely, I think the ACA really hit that on the head by saying that that's an ethical concern. Also, as a counselor educator, I educate future clinicians and therapists and counselors. I make sure that they understand that that is very important. So one of the things that I've actually done for my students, I've created a self-care assessment. So while they're in the classroom, in the ethics class, I have them to put together a self-care plan. I make them aware that, the line of work that they're going into, they're giving a lot of themselves. I often use the analogy of, like, for example, a mechanic can buy new tools. Like once his or her tools are worn out, he can go get new tools or take them somewhere and get them sharpened. Healers, clinicians and therapists, our bodies are our tools. So, we have to take care of them, because if we don't, we can't replace these bodies. So one of my self-care plans, one of my self-care activities is yoga. I'm an avid yogini. Like I said, when I go into the hospital, we're geared up in PPE, and we have the concern of the COVID-19 affecting us as well. So definitely that self-care piece helps to keep me grounded so that I can be there for other people who are in crisis. So number one, I think that's really important. Counselor self-care. What I'm seeing in the emergency rooms, this is something that's really interesting. A lot of people are coming into the emergency rooms thinking that they're experiencing the symptoms of COVID, because some of the symptoms are shortness of breath, heart palpitations. The symptoms are very similar to panic attacks. So we have a lot of people who are inundated, they're bombarded with the news and the media and text message. Everything is COVID this, COVID that. So when they come to the hospital, they often think that they have COVID, but they're having panic attacks. So we get a lot of that. So giving people education, like turn the TV off, take time for self-care during this time is really important. And like I said, I'm still using that theme from Dr. Coleman. It's definitely a radical act in this pandemic. People have to take care of themselves. I think, and then the last point that I want to make is African Americans. During this pandemic, we are affected more so than other communities, and some of those reasons stem back to historical traumas, as such as disparities in healthcare, or not having trust in the healthcare system. Like, for example, if you think of the Tuskegee experiments, or if you have heard of the Henrietta Lacks cells, where they pretty much, took this African-American woman's cells from her body, and they created all of these treatments for other people. However, she received no compensation. She pretty much was left to die. And still to this day, her family doesn't receive any compensation. So there's that fear and the lack of trust. So we have these disparities, and then we have these historical traumas on top of that, where we have evidence of things that have taken place, and we have evidences of these disparities. So there's a lot that's going on that's affecting people's their mental health. They're definitely stressed, and self-care during this time is more important, I think, than your economic resources. I mean, because if you can't take care of yourself and emotionally regulate, you can't make money. You just can't. And I keep that up front as well. So when I go to work, I tell myself I have to keep composed and self-regulate, because like I said, other people are looking to me as well, because they don't have an understanding, and they're looking for something, some type of normalcy. And right now everything is chaotic. So pretty much that's pretty much what I have to share in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you very much. Dr. Molock.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here with this distinguished panel. And I was sharing with you earlier before we started that I've been on a panel about self-care. This is my fourth one. So obviously, this is a really, really important topic. And I think it's a really important topic for people who are in ministry. I think it's an important topic for people who are in academia, people who are mental health professionals, because all of those people are first responders, even though they may not necessarily be identified that way. All of those professions are people who are caring for others, and they're also people who, they're the professions that people tend to look to for help and guidance. I think it's interesting to talk about the COVID-19 and self-care from the womanist perspective, because one of the tenets of womanism that we all know is that we are concerned about and care about the community. And it's one of the theological approaches that's very intentional about focusing on the intersectionality of the marginalization of people, particularly people of color. So we as womanists and as women, we know what it's like to come from multiply marginalized communities because of gender, racial inequities, gender inequities, economic status, sexual orientation, gender expression, physical ability, and the list goes on and on. And yet it's a well-kept secret that women of color are the most beleaguered women on the planet. And it's because we run around taking care of everybody but ourselves. And then we sometimes act like it's a sin to do that, or we're often told by other people that it's a crime to focus on self. And in one of the webinars I was in earlier a few weeks ago, one of the persons said, when I think about a woman taking care of herself, I think of a European woman who's at a spa getting a pedicure. And I thought that's really sad because we can't even imagine ourselves in space where we could engage in self-care.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to shift that paradigm a little bit, and particularly as womenist theologians, think about taking care of the community that cannot be separated from taking care of yourself. And one of the things I say in my church all the time is if we don't put our mask on first, we won't be there to help anybody else.
Right.
It's tempting to put the mask on other people. You know, on the airplane, they show you a picture of usually a mom and a child. And the temptation is to put the mask on the child first because your attention is for caring for others. But the fact is, if you're gasping for oxygen, you really won't be of any help to your child. So I think the other thing we have to think about is one of the strengths of womenist theology is that it is particularly tuned into what's going on with the entire community, not just segments of it.
Mm.
So one of our strengths is that we don't tend to compartmentalize how we see, love, and care for the community. But it also means that because we're so in tune to what's going on in the community, and we're so in tune to the challenges that we face with developing and sustaining communities that are inclusive and embrace equity on a number of fronts, but not just in our communities, but also in the Black church, then before it was a headline in the New York Times and the Washington Post, we already knew that the COVID-19 pandemic was going to disproportionately affect communities of color. This was not news to us. We already knew that Black folks had a higher prevalence of underlying conditions, diabetes, heart condition, et cetera. And we already know that people of color often have poor access to care. So that's not new to us. So sometimes I feel a little bit insulted when people say, is this the new normal? Because being negatively affected by a health crisis is not new, and it's not, unfortunately, abnormal in communities of color. We already know what it's like to be a member of multiply marginalized communities. We're already acutely aware of our intersectionality. We already know we wear millions of hats. And so because of the social location of Womanist, we are particularly focused on caring for and concerned about the least of these, which I think ironically makes us more overwhelmed in the context of a global pandemic, because we have our eyes on so many different people in so many different sections who were already marginalized long before the pandemic. And the icing on the cake of this, I think, is because of who we are, and because everyone tends to look to us for solutions to this very systemic problem, we get explicit and implicit messages from the community and sometimes from ourselves that we don't have time to be overwhelmed. I know when I was growing up, I was heard, Black women are strong, nothing can break us. We survived slavery. I remember my grandmother had 14 kids, and one of my aunts said to me, they call her mother. They said, mother never complained. And I said, you don't know what she was feeling because she didn't discuss that with you. She may have been, I'm sure she had overwhelming days with 14 children. And so I think that it's not good for us to get these messages that we internalize, that it is selfish for us to want to take just a little bit of time out to take care of ourselves. One of the things that I share with my students and also with my members of my church is I ask them, what do they do to play? And what I ask them to do is play every day, regardless of how many grant applications are due, what paper you have to write, what sermon you have to write, what Bible study you have to prepare for, whether you have to prepare for a webinar today, whatever you have to do, you need to take a little bit of time for yourself to play. And in my graduate program, I actually ask the students each week, what did you do to play? And it's like a home assignment for them. So the reason why I think this is so important is because you need to prioritize yourself. It's, again, to me, it's putting that mask on first. And if you don't prioritize yourself, it's just not going to work. The other thing I share with people in church, and they laugh about this, is when I play, I don't do anything related to psychology. I don't do anything related to religion. Because as much as I love the Lord, that's work for me. So I have to do something that's entertaining outside those two fields. I play lots of games on my computer, and I read trashy romance novels, and that's really true. I think we also need to really shift this paradigm that taking care of yourself is selfish, and that you are less likely to care for the community if you're thinking about yourself, because I think those things are fallacies. I think I wear a lot of hats. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a dog owner, I'm a professor, I'm a co-pastor. And I know that a lot of people look to me for guidance. And because of that, I have to really take time. I love what Dr. Coleman said about give yourself some grace. I have to acknowledge that it's okay for me to be overwhelmed. There's a concept called mindfulness in psychology, which is for you to be in the moment and acknowledge how you feel and what you're thinking, but to not critique it or judge it. And I think that's really hard for women to do, particularly women of color. And so I think it's really important to have time to lament sometimes. This is overwhelming. It is true that people are asking you to do a lot of things that are outside of your normal standard operating procedures. I know we joke about this in the church, but I have become a producer of our services because we're doing them on Zoom. I've used Zoom before, but never as the person in the background who's doing the production. And so I have to allow myself to make mistakes and not act like it's in the end of the world, because it's not. I think in the academic side of it, it's a very stressful time. We don't have any idea of how we're going to teach classes in the fall. There's lots of different theories about how to do that best. Because I teach in a doctoral program in clinical psych, we have students who are worried about funding. What happens if we furlough faculty? Will those classes still make? And if not, what will we do instead? We had to quickly move to teletherapy, which we had not trained our students to do because we have a clinic. Students are worried about, are they going to have enough hours for their internships and later on for licensure? I teach a course in the summer to Native Chinese students, and we normally do this program in Seoul, Korea. That was canceled, but now we're doing it all virtually using a platform called ClassIn that we've never used. And so I was on a phone call last night about that. And literally I had to tell myself all the time, you know what? It'll get done. Don't worry about it. Don't panic. Don't think too far, because mindfulness talks about not thinking too far in the future. Be in the moment now. I'm acknowledging that this is overwhelming. And then the thing I always share with myself is that it will get done, mistakes will be made, and no one will die. It'll be okay. I think that we also, unfortunately, someone mentioned earlier about the funerals. We've had, I think in my church, and I have a small church, we've had 5 funerals in 3 months.
Wow.
So it's really overwhelming. We've had Facebook Live funerals, we've had Zoom funerals. Unfortunately, my husband's cousin, he was very close to, just passed a few days ago. So his funeral is next week. So there's lots of loss, and I loved what someone said earlier. We're not able to engage in the rituals that we normally do to send our loved ones home, and that is very stressful. Just thinking about, we're all sheltering in place right now, but when our churches come back together to worship in person, how are we going to do that? When are we going to do that? Someone just shared with me the other day in another call I was on that they're encouraging people not to sing because apparently when you sing, more particles come out. And we're a Black church, and we were all looking at each other like, we not sing? We can't even imagine that, not having singing. And so all of this is really stressful. And so I think we can talk later on about things to do to kind of mitigate the stress. But the bottom line, part of it is we need to just acknowledge that it's stressful and acknowledge that it's upsetting. And then of course, I think in many congregations, they're wondering the theodicy question, which is, where is God in all of this? And is God still present? And are we in an apocalyptic kind of moment? And I think we have to all address that as well. So I think those are lots of things just for us to think about and talk about later on. But the biggest message I want to send is that it's important to take care of yourself. It's important to lament. It's okay to lament because it is a stressful time. And it's important to stay socially connected. I have spent more time with my church than I ever have. We have, in addition to our worship service, tonight we have book club every other week. We have Bible study. I teach stress management techniques and mindfulness on Tuesday evenings. I take calls in between. I'm checking up on people who I know, particularly people who have anxiety disorders, who I know in my congregation have lots of concerns about germs and infection, and as you were saying, people having panic attacks and going to the emergency room and not knowing the difference. We are sheltering in place with all my adult children, which I love in some ways because it's the first time we've all been together in 5 years. But we ran out of eggs. I bought 3 cartons of eggs, and they ate those in 4 days. So I was like, what? So a lot of adjustment.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Molock. Dr. Short.
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Smith, my colleague for the last year. I have loved working together. I'm honored and humbled to be here today. So I wanted to do what's been named by Dr. Molock just a minute ago and just acknowledge the enormity of grief and stress of the moment. Say a few things about the self of self-care, and then a couple of practices that I use in the pastoral care classroom. So I'm not a mental health professional, but I'm trained in clinical ethics and teach pastoral care at Columbia Theological Seminary. So first, I really think it's important and want to underscore what's been said about just acknowledging the stress and the overwhelmingness of the moment. So we know that personal stress, vocation, work, economy, family, extended family, school, church, childcare, elder care, healthcare, relationship stress, extra stress for people in dangerous situations, intimate partner violence, risk, stress, stress and just understanding who I am going through this pandemic hour by hour as my workplace and rhythms have changed. The stress of uncertainty, of constricted space, the stress of waiting, not knowing what next semester will be like, or next week, or tomorrow for some of us. And the great stress of grief around losses of significant rituals and gatherings. And I saw in the comments some things about media, the stress of voices downplaying the stress or manufacturing new stress for our consumption. So all of these stressors are, as has already been acknowledged, added to a baseline of stress, not new stress, for women and particularly for women of color. That's really woven into the fabric and rhythms of this country and all of our institutions. So that is not new. Acknowledging that is important. On top of that, women and particularly Black women tend to be ritual makers, midwives of births, leaders of death rituals, caretakers, and invisible laborers not recognized, affirmed, or compensated fairly for really important and vital work. So there's inequity in stress, then there's extra stress, and there's an inequity in that stress. And we know that survival is gendered, but also raced and classed and caught up in all the ways that we think about belonging. On top of that, there's this whole new area of theology in the last 10 years or so around moral stress and moral distress or moral injury. And that happens when we feel moral emotions like anger, disgust, frustration, lament, and particularly when we have to do something that we don't believe is the right thing to do, or when we can't do something that we know is the right thing to do. So we're seeing this in hospitals with distribution of resources not being able to be done equitably. And we're seeing this, as was already mentioned, in funerals and in the kind of person-to-person gathering that we know is right and healing and just cannot always happen in the same way today. So I wholeheartedly affirm Dr. Smith's emphasis on surviving the pandemic, acknowledging the stress and what's at stake and just how hard it is. In the classroom, I try to slow down and name what's going on with whatever we're talking about, in this case with stress. And also to help students take the time to think about, how do you feel stress in your body? What are your body's clues that this is the time to recenter, as Dr. Davis said, recenter, be in touch with myself so that I can put on that mask, as Dr. Molock said, and be available to others. When there's heightened crisis, we can lose touch with how we feel in our bodies. And then we become dangerous caregivers and risk burnout, which is all wrapped up in productivity and capitalism. So it's enticing, but to slow down and think about what did I already know before this crisis about how my body reacts to stress? And how is that showing up in those same predictable ways or in new ways, sideways in this pandemic? And to record that for myself and ask for help before I need help, and along the way. So I wanted to say a few things next about the self of self-care. So this is not an argument about whether or not self-care is important. I think we all agree that this is vital and life-saving. But as I've thought about this conversation, and particularly the political consequences of self-care, I love that part of the title. I've been thinking about my own shifts in my life about how I think about the self. And how I hear students and other people talking and preaching about the self. So how we understand the self of self-care has political consequences. And I remembered thinking about tonight that in my very first semester of college, I was called into my English professor's office, which you never know what that means. And he sat me down and he said, your assignment was to write about yourself. And you wrote about your parents. I want you to rewrite this about only yourself, which was troubling to me. It was not the first time. It's certainly not the only time I would receive such counsel as an academic. Don't write about your family. Don't write about yourself. Don't write about your connections to creation and to your mentors and other people. And really just don't write about yourself at all. Don't be vulnerable in your writing or in your scholarship. So I learned that to assert myself, much less in a way that's connected personally and theologically to other people, is a radical act. It's a political act. I was told in that office and in many other ways in the academy and beyond that I have a self, I embody myself can be whole by itself. I can choose to serve, give, connect, consume, or aspire out of my own self with its own very constructed limitations. And for women living in a world that's so often hostile to and dismissive of women, this is not nothing to claim the self. That's a kind of radical thing. The thought that I, as a woman, could have a healthy whole self in charge of and capably responsible for my own choices is significant. So believing and centering, particularly minoritized women, as Dr. Coleman said, is not only the church's first resurrection dilemma in the Christian tradition, but believing and centering the voices and narratives of minoritized women is a theme in so much womanist work that influences my own work. But this self-contained self with choices is also partial, and aspiring to be self-sufficient self risks disconnection and loneliness. As a white woman, the longstanding temptation to ally around gender and just stop there and not go deeper in terms of connection is always present, and I have to guard against that faithfully and with accountability. So this idea of what is the self that's fundamentally connected to other people and all of creation has really nagged at me throughout my life, but it didn't really settle into my bones until I left the United States and lived abroad in Suriname, South America for several years. And I learned a language and was welcomed into a culture that did not have the first person I in the language. And that was very different from me, who'd grown up in Atlanta in the South as a white Christian woman, where white Christian nationalism was masked as niceness or not making a fuss. I learned a lot about being shaped by a private self. And in being in a community where everything was shared, power was shared, voice was shared, resources were shared, rituals were shared, I learned a lot more about the self of self-care and the kind of fundamental connections with that. that a healthy sense of self is profoundly connected to other people in time and space. So when I move through the world in this body, of course, I bring my parents with me. I bring my body with me. I am a spouse and a mother and a friend and a neighbor. I have living children. I have had reproductive loss. I bring all of these experiences with me. I carry the blessings and burdens of elders, mistakes and grace, the hopes and dreams of many people. And I work in an educational system that wants me to be a soloist, that likes single author books and not valuing collaborative work. So I have to radically assert that there is never a space and time where I am alone, a sole voice, but always connected to others. And when I feel most alone, there are ghosts and there's the Holy Ghost around. So there's always fundamental connection. So I think when we talk about practices of self-care, this idea in the back of our minds and bodies about what is the self really affects what it looks like for us to practice self-care. So if the self is defined only by its own maintenance without respect to other people at the same time, then that kind of self-care during the pandemic will privilege choice. So it might look like self-growth and expansion. It will address the profound threat to self-cohesion and the real loneliness that a lot of us hear about and feel. And that will inform our choices around really important self-care practices like drinking water and tea, taking baths, breathing deeply at a time when breath is so at risk, moving our bodies, eating well, stretching, reaching out to friends and family, wearing a mask, washing our hands. And I love Dr. Coleman said dancing. I mean, let us keep dancing. So this is the self of free, liberated choice. But in its extreme version, the self that makes these choices by itself, for itself, it thrives in patriarchy, hierarchy, and supremacist structures. And that is really on full display today, certainly in national narratives that we're hearing. And I'm in Georgia, so at the local level too. So I believe that the self is an individual in a way, embodied with particularity and uniquely storied, and at the same time profoundly connectional in multiple webs of relationships. So in this sense, when I think about self-care in pandemic, it does involve choosing to drink water and eat well and talk to other people with care and concern. But there's a sense of solidarity that is accompanying every turn. So I'll drink water and I'll take baths and I'll advocate for clean water in Flint, Michigan at the same time. I'll inhale breath and I'll resist rainforest deforestation that is actually increasing during the pandemic. There's new research that came out about that today. I'll exhale breath and I'll say the names of people whose breath is cut short. Even just in the last weeks, right? Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and way too many names. One name is too many names. So, and I'll say these names not just as a ritual, but as an ache where I believe that my own self and self-care is diminished when anyone is made to lose their breath in violent and tragic ways. So I'll move my body as a claim that liberation is possible, and I'll bear witness to and tell the truth about immigrant detention and the restriction of movement. I'll eat good food and I'll think about labor movements and farming. I'll stretch and reach out, wear a mask and wash my hands. And I'll be thinking about stereotypical, lethal surveillance, gender-based oppression for other people who cover their faces at much greater risk. And tangible reminders like masks and gloves will remind me to resist the bigotry foisted upon Asian American neighbors in this pandemic, which is just horrific and increasing. And I will dance. For me, that's tap dancing, but we all have our own forms of dance. And I'll feel my connection to a ground that has a story and a history. Tap dance has an amazing history, and I continue to love learning about that, where the rhythm that I make joins the rhythm of other people for generations before and after me. So the very last thing I wanted to say is that I work in my pastoral care classes at some practices with students throughout the semester that help sustain practices of care and kind of guard against burnout. So I thought I would just do one of the quick exercises we do, sometimes just at the beginning of class, and when we need to, we do it throughout class. So I'll say a phrase, and then I just say 1, 2, 3 in class, and we all say it together so we can practice saying these phrases. So I won't count right now, but I'll say a phrase and pause, and if you want to practice saying it, if that's something that you need now, I invite you to do that. And I'll just do 4 of these. So first, I believe you. I believe you. Second, I need a network of support and care. So I need a network of support and care. Third is I am good enough and I deserve dignity. I am good enough and I deserve dignity.
I'm good enough and I deserve dignity.
And a 4th one, my survival matters for you and your survival matters for me. My survival matters for you and your survival matters for me. There are other phrases that I use depending on what we're reading. Some weeks we're reading Dr. Coleman's work to help us out with pastoral theology and why it matters. And it is astounding how much, especially this first phrase, I believe you, to be told that, to hear that about oneself. I believe in myself too, included. But to say to someone else, I believe you, is really a radical thing. I'm not a womanist, but I'm a womanist ally. And to me, that means a commitment to be in conversation with womanists. And so I'm just thrilled and humbled really to be invited into such a conversation. Oftentimes I consider myself an accountable audience member to other panels that Dr. Smith has arranged. And so it's quite something to be here. So I just want to close by saying some names of people who hold me accountable in this work with gratitude. So my pastoral theology colleagues, Shanika Walker-Barnes, Phyllis Shepard, Beverly Wallace, Stephanie Crumpton, my womanist mentors, Belva Brown Jordan, Alexis Carter Thomas, and my womanist collaborators and mentors and colleagues at Columbia, Marcia Riggs, Lisa Weaver, Love Seacrest, and our host, of course, Mitzi Smith, because naming is also a political act of self-care and survival. So thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Mindy McGarrah Sharp. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, we don't have plenty of questions, but now we have, last but not least, Dr. Soholm.
All right, thank you. And I'm gonna read my talk because I didn't want to forget anything. So I wrote it down. Going into my middle ages, you tend to forget more things.
That's all right.
So for me, self-care is synonymous with self-discovery and self-healing. Self-care really is about the business of getting to know oneself, accepting one's authentic self, including getting to know one's unique gifts and using those gifts to live out one's purpose. As children, we ideally learn the art of self-care from our parents and other adults on how to be safe and protected from danger, how to live a happy and peaceful life, how to maintain healthy and strong bodies, and how to move through life with ease and well-being. And these ideas are taken from our Buddhist loving-kindness prayer. I believe this process begins in the womb. Our mothers first taught us how to care for ourselves, or in some cases, how to harm ourselves way back in the womb. So if our mothers did not know how to properly care for themselves and therefore us, we're already behind in the art of self-care at birth. Unfortunately, this is the reality for many people in general, and for communities of color, this intergenerational patterning is a reality we do not escape from easily. It takes conscious and dedicated effort to become aware of, as well as to heal from this patterning. When I first start working with new clients, whether in my therapy or shamanic practice, I give a mini lecture about the reality of our current situation on the planet, meaning we live in a culture that is traumatized and disconnected.
Mm.
The world as we know it in Western industrialized societies is set up to make us sick. So we're constantly fighting to become healthy in a sick system.
Mm.
Therefore, when individuals engage in self-care, they're only scratching the surface by doing specific activities that may ease their stress temporarily to better cope in a sick world. The trajectory of what we see as a successful life in modern societies goes something like this. You start becoming institutionalized via daycare around age 3 or 4, start school around age 5 or 6. You're encouraged to do well in school to ensure future success by going to another school called college. And you better end up at a good college or else you won't have a good life. And now we're told college is not enough. You have to at least have a master's degree to thrive and be competitive in the current market. Then you get a job, find a partner, have a family, then retire if you're able to financially. Then what? Then you're supposed to have made it and achieved happiness. But are we happy? The reality of this life is that it is one of trauma and disconnection. We have to recognize that the above description of modern existence is one of colonization and patriarchy, leading to further trauma for women of color. So sometimes we get stuck in the trauma response of the following 3 Ds: distraction, disconnection, and dissociation. Distraction, we keep ourselves busy to the detriment of our health, mind, body, and spirit, so that we can feel good about being productive and therefore having worth. Disconnection, work, entertainment, and leisure activities are designed to keep us further away from our authentic selves instead of connecting us to our purpose and to others in a meaningful way. Dissociation, we engage in constantly numbing ourselves through food, sex, alcohol, drugs, and technology in order to disengage from the experience of living in the moment. Mindless activities fill our days, leaving us feeling empty and alone. When the pandemic hit, it revealed to us how we have been distracting, disconnecting, and dissociating from ourselves on a daily basis. So it makes sense that when many of our activities of distraction have been taken away from us, that we're experiencing an acute surge of anxiety and angst. I believe this is an opening and an opportunity to work on self-discovery and self-healing. True self-care means for me connecting to yourself, your gifts, and your purpose. Self-care is connecting to your authentic self. But this gets tricky for women of color because there are many barriers to connecting to our authentic self due to the trauma of life. I take a mind, body, spirit approach to implement self-care. The work involves decolonizing the mind, body, and spirit, as well as walking the hero's journey, or in this case, heroine's journey, to actualize one's gifts. Self-care means decolonization. If you've gone through the Western school system, your mind, body, and spirit have been colonized. Education, and Western education specifically, is a highly effective tool of colonizing women of color. Many communities of color work towards sending their children off to elite Western institutions to ensure future success of their children. In my culture, Korean parents sacrifice absolutely everything, even the family unit, in order to provide their children with a so-called superior education in the US. People who hold degrees from Western colleges and universities are given jobs over those who do not speak English or have studied abroad. In this process, so much trauma occurs at the individual and communal levels. And in turn, you become colonized and lose your indigenous ways of being. An example of this is the honoring of the connectedness of life, which means what I do affects others. And interconnectedness dissolves in bettering yourself in the competitive market. Becoming more independent and disconnected from our families and communities is a necessary part of Western ideas of success. Ancestral work. When we speak about intergenerational trauma, Indigenous people knew that what happened to our parents and grandparents affected us deeply. In the process of helping clients decolonize, and this is particularly important for women of color, but I believe white individuals also need to do this work. I teach people how to work on clearing negative ancestral energy, as well as honoring their ancestors. We clear the trauma and toxic patterns, but we also honor the gifts that our ancestors gave us. We now know from scientific research on epigenetics that what happens to our ancestors directly affects us, even if we have never met them. Today, young women of color are returning to their indigenous spiritual practices. This is powerful because even if you're unfamiliar with these practices on a conscious level, our DNA recognizes that these practices are a part of our being. So find out about your ancestors. Where are your people from? What types of practices do they engage in for healing and growth? This is the work of decolonizing that all people must engage in. And lastly, self-care is answering the call of your heroine's journey. Self-discovery and self-healing is the hero's journey, the heroine's journey. For those of you unfamiliar with this idea, Joseph Campbell, a scholar of comparative literature, popularized the idea of the mythic hero who goes on a great adventure, fights evil, gains victory, and returns home changed or transformed to help his fellow men. I believe every one of us is called to the great adventure called life. Most people do not answer this call, and certainly most women of color get crushed by racism and sexism that they never even get an opportunity to properly hear the call, let alone answer the call. However, if you are in a position where you are hearing the call and are able to take this great adventure, I highly recommend you take the first step. Your inner wisdom and ancestors are supportive of your path of self-discovery and self-healing. And this I call true self-care, where you meet your authentic self, discover and honor her special gifts given by the Creator. We're in dire need of healers and visionaries. Will you engage in true self-care and allow your authentic self to flourish in order to help other sisters suffering from the crushing weight of toxic systems on the planet? I'll say that one more time. I'll ask one more time. Will you engage in true self-care and allow your authentic self to flourish in order to help other sisters suffering from the crushing weight of toxic systems on the planet? I hope your answer is a big fat yes. Thank you. Oh, can't hear you, Mitzi.
I'm sorry I had muted myself. Thank you so much, Dr. Soholm. Very powerful. All of these presentations have been so helpful, so powerful. So now we have some questions. And I'm going to start with the question that is already, we have a Q&A, which is different. I want to say different from the chat room. The Q&As should go in the Q&A box, just for those who are new here. So here's our first question here. And then I want to ask a question while others are putting their questions in the Q&A. If you'll put them in the Q&A and not the chat box. So it says, Dr. Short speaks about the connected or relational self. And I agree that this is our needed self-understanding. Can she speak about how even that self does experience loneliness and isolation? And what should we do when we feel lonely or isolated as we embrace being in relationship with others? That's an important question. How do we deal with the fact that we still experience loneliness and isolation even as we are connected to others, and that may have something to do with who we're connected with. Anyway, this was addressed to Dr. Sharp.
Well, I'm happy to start since it was addressed to me, but I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say, because I already have heard clues of a response in my sister panelists' responses. Yes, we need to acknowledge the profound loneliness and isolation, especially where quarantine is mandated, needed, a part of loving our neighbor, to stay in and to be much more isolated than many people are used to being, or to have to work and then, be lonely in that way. So there's levels of loneliness. So, I mean, I have two things come to mind right away. One is to have accountability partners. So people who you check in with on a regular basis on the hardest time of the day for you. So maybe that's Thursday, or maybe that's Monday morning, or maybe that's really late in the evening, and you just have an accountability covenant partner to check in with on a regular basis. I was working with a student recently on establishing accountability partners, and she was feeling very risky disclosing certain things she was working on with another person. And so she started writing letters to an ancestor grandmother about how she was doing and what she needed. And that was ended up being a deep form of connection and accountability that was available all the time, not just certain times of day. So that's one. And then I think a second thing that comes to mind beyond accountability is to lean on the arts. So I feel like part of the work of decolonizing is recovering art forms, because colonization goes after art, goes after dance, it paints over murals, it goes after all kinds of art forms, it exhausts artists. And so there is so much free shared art right now that is just exploding and accessible. So for example, yesterday I listened to a panel of choreographers talk about performance in a new way. And that's not my line of work, but I do use choreographers' work to think about teaching. And I'm thinking about teaching in a new way. And so it just connected me to these ideas, even though I was in my home alone, in the room alone, not my home alone at that moment, but connecting to artists who were passionately being creative and restoring art in a new way where space is going to be maybe different for a while. So accountability and art are my two things that come to mind, but I'd love to hear what others.
Yeah, so anyone else on the panel, please respond to, even though it was addressed to, we'd like to hear other people respond to how do you deal with isolation and loneliness, even when you are in relationship with others?
Like what Dr. Sharp said, I think another thing you can do too is to rekindle old connections. We've been really encouraging people in our church to do that. Sometimes this is a great opportunity for reconciliation, because I think one thing a pandemic will make you do is reshift your values about what's important and what's not. And it doesn't have to necessarily be because you fell out, you're not in a relationship with that person anymore. It could just be people you haven't talked to. One of the things I love about Facebook is I've been able to connect with people. I'm connected with a person I knew from 7th grade, and I'm 63. So just to be able to do that has been joyful, because we have a shared history and we have a shared experience, which is really good. But the other thing I want to talk about, and I think one of the panelists mentioned this earlier, is don't assume because people are sheltering in place with other people that they don't also feel lonely. Sometimes that's the worst loneliness you can have, when you're in a space with other people, and in theory, you're not supposed to be by yourself or not supposed to feel lonely and isolated, and you do. And we should also remember that people who are sheltering in place sometimes have really toxic relationships. And in general, these those of us who are therapists know that people don't usually do better in times of crises. They do fall back on their default, which is not usually healthy. So it's also important to reach out to those people that you know or maybe suspect don't have the healthiest relationships at home, and to be that sort of lifeline for that person too. I think the other thing you can do is figure out ways to create community. I think the good and the bad about social media.
Dr. Molock, let me just interrupt you. When your previous answer before you just went on is what she was getting at, is the fact that she is in relationship with others, she or he, but there's still the loneliness.
Right.
Yes. So
I think, you need to figure out ways
to address that. Yes.
So as a therapist, I would say to you, fixing those relationships at this time may not be possible. I'm not saying it is impossible, but it's challenging. I think the stress levels are really high, and I don't know what's going on in that person's life, personally, but there could be other stressors that are difficult to navigate around, which can include financial stressors with parenting, with other relationships. And so I think sometimes in those cases, you could try to figure out, well, there is teletherapy. So there are people who are doing family therapy and individual therapy online. And you can go to places like Psychology Today has a pretty good referral source. Or if there's another person on this call or on this webinar that you trust, you can also make referrals. The Association of Psychologists makes referrals. And so most states now have relaxed their requirements for teletherapy to make it easier for people to get teletherapy. And so my understanding is that in most states, you can even cross state lines right now. That's not unusual, but right now you can do that. That's one thing. But also reconnect with other people, family members, loved ones. Is it the same thing as an in-person touch or hug? No, but it's also not as bad as being completely isolated from someone else. And I think several panelists talked about it's important to share your story. I cannot stress that enough. When you share your story, you realize you're not the only person going through that. And sometimes in sharing stories, you create community out of that as well. So I would say to you, really try to stay connected in other ways with other people. I don't know, I think because I used to work in intimate partner violence, I think it's dangerous to try to fix all that right now. Then you don't have enough support around you, and you also don't have the avenue of being able to leave. So I would say right now, be Switzerland or like have neutrality around those issues and don't necessarily try to solve those issues right now.
Anyone else want to? Yes, Monica, Dr. Coleman.
I appreciate all you said, and I just wanted to emphasize that it doesn't take a lot. Right? We often think like, how do I create community? And that's a big, hard task, right? Like, how do I make new friends? And how do I get to my people? And it really can be one or two simple things. An example I'll give is, as many people know, my mother passed away in March. So not related to COVID-19, but still in that season where our rituals are impossible to enact. And from the moment my mother went into hospice, I have one friend from across the country who texts me every day, just every day. We're 3 hours apart time zone, to say, how are you doing today? How are you doing today? And I know that, if I don't answer that day, someone's going to know I'm missing, right? Someone's just checking in to know, I know you're not okay. And I want you to know I'm thinking about you. There's nothing you can fix or solve, but it cuts that isolation, right? And I can be that for someone else. So there's a person who I'm like, every day I'm like, I'm texting you or I'm hitting you on Instagram or something so that I see you or I'm looking for you. And so it doesn't, our social media personalities, right? They're curated. It's the healthy, happy version of ourselves. But you don't need a whole lot of people, just one or two who you can check in with so that you're not completely alone.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and my condolences. I didn't know your mom passed. My condolences. Somebody brought up before I go to the next question, Facebook, and I found that a mixed bag. Where yes, there are connections, but I've been able to make connections with people on Facebook, off of Facebook, which I find more refreshing, and they're family members who I've had to like block But I say to them, well, we're family. You should talk to me anyway, right? So there are times where Facebook is, to me, sort of intensifies my isolation and loneliness. And I have to come away from Facebook because I kind of feel more drawn from, if that makes sense. And sometimes I don't feel connected to people on Facebook in the way I need to. And I have to draw back from Facebook not to feel as isolated as I do sometimes in the mix of Facebook, if that makes sense.
I think sometimes, I think you bring up a really good point. Part of self-care, when I say prioritize what you need, is really being honest with yourself. And so, because sometimes what we get caught up in is, I don't want to hurt that person's feelings, they really need me. And we sometimes need to set boundaries. I think those of us who are mental health professionals, we know this. Every time you go to a reception, a cocktail party, people find out you're a psychologist. I'm a child psychologist for training. Let me tell you about my nephew. And so you have to kind of say, you know what? You're here right now to have a party, and me too. You know, I also need downtime. And I think I'm really good at blocking people. I get a lot of friend requests, and if I don't know you, I say no. And I know people think that's mean, but I don't want to have a whole lot of Facebook friends. I don't. I feel like I answer 200 emails a day. I have Facebook, I have Instagram, I'm talking to people on the phone. And so it's okay for me to step back and say, I am now inundated with social gatherings and intercourse and all that. And it's okay for me to say, I need a break from that. Just like it's okay for me to say, when some people text, Mitzi, you did this to me and I respected that. I was forwarding a video that someone gave me on IM, and she wrote a note and said, please stop sending those videos on IM because I want to use this for another reason. And I hadn't even thought about that. And I wrote her back, sorry. And to me, you need to do that because people use it for different things. And if it's not helpful to you, don't do it and don't feel guilty about it. You know, it's not the way that you use social media doesn't have to be the way everyone else uses it.
And I appreciated the way you responded. Yeah, so I've heard from Dr. Soholm, two words that came up in Bell Hook's book, Sisters of the Yam, is self-discovery, and then you just mentioning truth-telling as a part of self-care, that you can't have self-care without self-discovery and without truth-telling, right? Which I found powerful and brought up by in different ways by the panel today. So the next question is from Sheena, I believe. How do you go about the work of decolonizing and clearing negative ancestral energy if we cannot trace our ancestry due to slavery or adoption? Who would like to respond?
May I start?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And then I just had a little thought on the first question before I skipped to this one.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't ask an important question about feelings. The feelings serve a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And if we jump to, well, first of all, we categorize feelings as positive or negative. So if we're feeling lonely, usually in our culture, that means a negative emotion.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to question that, and that all feelings and emotions serve a function, and that we shouldn't immediately jump to the act of trying to get rid of this emotion because we're uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the first act that I suggest to clients when they're feeling intense isolation or loneliness is to sit with it, to just simply acknowledge how they're feeling and to sit with the feeling, and that is not a threat as big as you thought it might be. So sometimes we act too quickly to get rid of emotions we're uncomfortable with, which will just create a negative cycle, because ultimately you have to be able to contain your emotions. And the practice of sitting with negative emotions even can bring you something important, can bring up something. So I just like to suggest that practice also. And it's a part of mindfulness practices to sit with whatever is coming your way that day.
Mhm.
So, and then I'll answer the second question. That question is a product also of our colonizing, to only believe in things that we can see or touch in the material world. If you start engaging in spiritual work, your ancestors are there for you, and you will know how to contact them because we all have the tools. These spiritual gifts are a part of our evolutionary history. So for example, for me, dreaming is one of the ways that my spirits and my ancestors make contact with me. And for me, the spirit world is right here. It's not somewhere far away. It's very close. And every night when I go to bed, I encounter many different, spirits and ancestors, and you can develop your dream work. There are practices where you practice dreams, and the art of dreaming and remembering dreams and engaging with the spirit world through dreams. So that's just one example of how we're already primed in our evolutionary history to engage with the spirit world. That's what our ancestors did. So you may not know them in the way that I may know my grandmother because I knew her in physical form. And there's some loss and grief with that, but you can certainly have access to them on the other side because they're not lost to you. And that's the beauty of doing spiritual work. I hope that makes sense.
Mhm. Yes. Anyone else? Dr. Coleman? Yes. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, I very much echo what you're saying, and Dr. Soholm, in terms of our ancestors. I think that sometimes we feel if we don't know the names of our ancestors, if we don't have the family tree, that our ancestors are lost to us.
Mhm.
But again, we carry them with us, right? We know this genetically, right? We carry their DNA, we carry their stories, we carry their spirits with us, right? And so in traditional African religions, we honor our ancestors. That's like the one common thing you could say of all the traditions, that they honor ancestors. And one of the easiest ways, right, to do that is, and there's so many different ways, is to put together an ancestral altar of whatever size you like to do, of whatever you have, and you just, you can speak within yourself because your ancestors are within you, right? In your spirit, the spirits are here. They're not, again, far off. They're here within us, and they're here close to us.
Mhm.
And I think just honoring them, saying, I don't know your name, but I know you are here. I know you're there. I want to know the best of you. I want to heal the hardest parts of you. I think just having that desire, taking that time, sitting, kind of sitting with whatever altar you put together, if you decide to do one, or even if it's just one thing, a memento that either belong to an ancestor or just reminds you of an ancestor, right? It's holding that kind of intention, I think, that is a first step, right? I think you give them, a first step in us saying like, hey, this is how we do it. And for the ones that we do know and remember, we want to, I would say always emulate the best of them and learn from what they didn't do so great and say, how can I not do that too? Right? That's part of how we honor our ancestors. Is seeking out the best of them and trying to heal, to elevate, or to disremember, for lack of a better term, right? The other parts, the negative parts, the less liberating parts of them. And I think different religious traditions have different rituals for doing that. But there are rituals for doing that in different traditions, but all of us have ancestors and we can all honor them. And we don't have to know their names because they know us.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Thank you so much, you two. Okay, so our next question is for any panelists. If you know you have purpose in life and are still trying to find that purpose, can you or how can you deal with your mental self-care and still search for your purpose?
I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think you're always evolving. You're always trying to figure out who you are. The person who I was when I was 25 and how I dealt with my mental health well-being is really different, thank goodness, than how I deal with it now. And I was sharing with someone recently that I'm a few years from retirement, and I was making a joke about that, about I feel like an OG sometimes, because when people talk to me, they'll say things like, "Oh, we really appreciate I do suicide prevention research. We really appreciate you." And I was like, well, I'm not ready to go out to pasture yet. So people talk to you in that language. And so, in every stage of your life, you have different ways of understanding who you are and what that means. I love the concept of grace that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Coleman, because I exercise so much more grace with myself now. The older I get, and also I learned not to take myself so seriously. I learned that I don't have to be defined by how many publications I have in a year, and did I get an award, and all of that. The older you get, thank goodness, you get freed up from a lot of that bondage. And that is part of that journey, is figuring out who I am, but also figuring out what's gonna optimize my mental well-being, and do I need to really worry about stuff that I was worried about at 25 that at 65 I think is funny now, but also for those of us who are older, not minimizing the journey of people who are younger than we are, because I think that old adage, if you lose a partner or you lost a loved one, and your parents would say there are plenty of fish in the sea, but you just started fishing, so you don't know that. So to kind of appreciate that we're all evolving and that we're all in different developmental periods, and in some periods of your life things are more important than others, and that's part of your journey. And I think to be open to what God has for you, what the Spirit has for you, what relationships have for you. Learn not to be so self-critical, and to kind of think about, even in the relationships that don't work out well, whether they're romantic or platonic, or jobs that don't work out well, what did you learn about yourself? Because in all of the things I've made mistakes in, I've learned some really good lessons. And I've learned some things not to do. And I've also learned to forgive myself for a lot of mistakes that I made when I was younger.
Yes, thank you. I think so much, and you all may have a different take on this, but I think sometimes so much emphasis on everybody having one purpose, right, puts an enormous amount of pressure on us and so forth, instead of thinking about perhaps, what is it that we like to do? What is it that we like to be good at it? What is it that we are good at? And my career in religion is late, right? Some people are probably about ready to retire my age. But, late, and I did quite a few things. And I remember someone saying to me when I was in DC too, so, God is going to bring all these things together. So not to think about the different things we do as if they are not important in that moment, and that they will not contribute to this evolution of the self, right? That they are all important, and they all feed into who I am and who I become at this point. So I would like to see us relieve ourselves of that pressure that we have to find one purpose in life, right? But perhaps think about what it is we can and we like to do, in this moment, that we can do and do well and contribute to who we are and who we are becoming and who we want to be and what we like to do and so forth, if that makes sense. Anyone else want to comment on that point? That it's an important question. Yeah, we evolve. The older we get, I hope we become. I know we don't always become wiser and be able to laugh at ourselves. There was a time where I spent a whole week ruminating over what I did wrong, but now maybe a half hour. Oh well, right.
I wanted to add one little thing else to that, Mitzi, which is that in the Christian Bible, there's a scripture that people sometimes misquote about all things work together for good. And I always have some issues with that, because people have trauma and we have all kinds of atrocities. I'm like, that was not meant for good, okay? There's no way to reframe that. But what I do think happens on your individual spiritual journey is that things that have happened to you in the past that are painful prepare you for stuff that's going to come up ahead of you.
Yeah.
And just, I remember I went to undergraduate school in the 70s, and I was one of the first group of women who went to Dartmouth College. And that was one of the most toxic experiences of my life.
Mm.
I was 18. I went to an all-girl high school, so I kind of knew that there was sexism, but not in a personal way. In my family, people were raised that women could do anything you wanted to do. I never thought that I couldn't do something because I was a woman. I never thought that girls were dumb and I never heard any of that. And so when I got there and I was so objectified, in some ways it was worse than the racism in some ways. So fast forward, when I went through other things in my life where I was the first to do something, I was the first person licensed and ordained in a Southern Baptist church, believe it or not. To me, by the time I got to that experience in my early 40s, I could almost laugh about it because I had gone through the Dartmouth experience. And so I would look and say, this is the best you got to do? This is all you can say, you know? I was almost like, bring it on, because this was nothing compared to what I went through then. So if God helps you, you can use that stuff, including the painful stuff, because it strengthens you for other battles that you don't even know are going to come up. Never did I think I was going to be in ministry, and never did I think I was going to be pastoring a church. So I had no idea that I would be able to use that to strengthen me for that battle. But, you know, you don't know that. So just be open to the journey.
Exactly. Yes. And I hope I didn't give the impression. I have to find that text problematic too. But what I was talking about is my education, right? Because I have these different degrees, right? Which would have took me in different directions. You know, as a legal secretary, as a certified legal assistant, then theology, then this, that, and the other, right? But they come together. So I'm speaking more in terms of career choices, right, and education, but not So I'm not saying that all bad things are happening. No, So thank you for clarifying that, because some people may have gotten that impression. Thank you. So next question. I would love to hear thoughts for those of us who are stretched thin in how many connections they have. Stretched thin by too many connections, I'm assuming. Staying connected is taking more and more energy, and it can be difficult to justify the self-care of introverting. Dr. Davis.
It's okay to let go, and you don't always owe explanations, because you know you're taking care of yourself. I think sometimes people are really hard on themselves, where they think they must do this or they have to, you know, interact with this person. But you know, you have self-care is primary and first. You have to. It's almost like the analogy that Dr. Molock used earlier. She used the analogy of, you know, a mother putting on her mask first, you know, versus her child. You know, similar to flight attendants. You know, if they don't put their mask on first, you know, if they put it on someone else first, and if they don't put it on themselves, then they will not be able to take care of themselves. You get what I'm saying? So it's okay to, you know, just focus on yourself and take care of yourself. And sometimes you just have to not worry about what other people say. I mean, ultimately, in speaking from, you know, my own experiences, sometimes I do, I mean, I'm naturally an introvert. So sometimes I do, you know, kind of go into a little cubby hole. But at the same time, you know, you come out and, you know, you talk to people and let them know, the people who you care about. I mean, I'm not saying everyone, because explaining to everyone can be draining. But, you know, for those people who you care about, those who you love, you know, your immediate circle, I would say, yeah, definitely, you know, stay in communications with them. But everybody on Facebook, everybody on Instagram, it will run you ragged, and you will lose energy. So you do have to be a little selfish with your self-care sometimes. And I know a lot as women, you know, we're often taking care of other people, but yeah, you do have to be a little selfish sometimes to maintain your equilibrium and your peace. So it's okay sometimes to just let go, you know, not permanently, but just for a little while, just to take care of yourself.
Right, and you don't have to justify it.
Right, definitely.
No need to justify it, yes. or to see it as selfish, right? And see, well, she described herself as stretched thin. So it is time to stop stretching ourselves thin. And for the first time this year, I've never done this before. The first time this year, a person wouldn't let me back out of a writing assignment, and I said, you know what I did? I'm like, well, when the deadline comes, she will not have to pay me. And that was the first time ever in my life I did that. But, you know, I just could not this time. And there's one other piece I know I'm not going to write. And I have to give myself permission. Right? That's just the way it's going to be. You know? Because some people will try to guilt you into. And I'm saying, I just said to you, I can't. And you can expect it all you want, but it won't be there. Right? Okay. Anybody else want to respond to that? Okay, so how can my friends who missed this amazing discussion, how will they see it? It is being recorded. It was on my Facebook site, but evidently because I gave up the host, it is no longer there. I'm learning. I'm learning. Okay, so how do you balance specifically in academia, micro and macro aggressions, while also balancing self-care in the midst of consuming leadership roles?
Oh, that's a rough one. Yes, micro and macro aggressions. Microaggressions are pretty much, you know, insults, slight insults. Sometimes they're intentional, sometimes they're not. And in academia, you know, where there's a lot of different cultures and sometimes they're competing, yeah, sometimes there's a lot of insults and slights. And
okay, so Dr. Davis
mean to insult me.
Okay. Yes.
Can you hear me?
A little bit. You froze up a little on us, so we missed a little of that.
Where did you leave off at? I mean, where did I leave off at? Where did it freeze?
You were saying there are a lot of micro and macro aggressions that we have to navigate, and we missed the rest.
Right, and being on the receiving end, sometimes you don't know if the person's intentions were to insult you or was it something that was unconscious. So it's disheartening. It does cause stress. I won't deny that. And in an academic setting, you know, where you're a student, and yes, professors aren't exempt from these biases, and yes, they can have these insults and slights and may be aware of it and may not. So I would say self-care. Definitely.
How do you, her question is, how do you balance self-care in the midst of all that?
And you know, I guess I'm speaking, I've had an experience like this in my doctoral program where, yeah, I had some professors who didn't like, you know, the topics that I chose to discuss and things of that nature. And I remember one of my cohorts told me, you know, don't discuss this until you're able to discuss it with your students, share your experience. So definitely, it was definitely a stressful experience. You know, you being a student and you have your superiors, and, you know, you want to make a good impression. But then, like I said, sometimes, you know, oftentimes they have biases, cultural biases against, you know, their students that they may be aware of and may not. So self-care, taking care of yourself, having collective support, you know, from your family members, people who love you. Like, for example, your elders. I think Dr. Soholm mentioned this, you know, your elders who have experienced, you know, racism and discrimination. Like, for example, my parents, you know, they're from the 60s and 70s and things of that nature. And I've heard a lot of their stories of what they did to resist racism and oppression and to keep their mental stability. It wasn't always an easy thing, but they accomplished it. So definitely that collective support and those stories from people who you trust and love, you know, who have persevered, you know, hearing that they persevered and they made it through gives you hope. And it gives you the ability to even compose yourself in the face of these micro and macro aggressions that you're trying to decipher whether or not they're intentional or unconscious bias. So yeah,
Okay.
resorting back to your self-care and your collective support, that will definitely help a person to navigate through those murky waters of micro and macro aggressions. They can definitely be debilitating.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Yes, thank you, Dr. Davis. So Dr. Coleman has her hand up there, okay?
Okay.
I think I agree with everything you're saying. And I like to add that I think balance is a fallacy. I think we're always like, how do we balance work and home? Or how do we balance self-care? There's no balance. You know, on your worst days, it's managing the chaos. And on your best days, it's like, okay, we got a stride here. But I think if we're thinking about how do we keep it all even, how do we give equal parts, we don't, right? Each day is a little different. I think that one of the challenges that happens for those of us who are in academia and those of us who have made our vocation our job, right, who made our calling, who have aligned our work life with our calling, is that people think you don't have work hours, right? And that you can like just be on it all the time if you don't work a 9 to 5. And you know, some people actually are able to do it between 9 to 5. I'm not one of those people, but there are times you just say it's a job and you turn it off, right? Like if I die tomorrow, they will replace me, right? But there are some people for whom I'm not replaceable. And so, you know, I think for me, it's been keeping that in mind. Well, maybe they won't get replaced this year, but generally speaking, that they're jobs, they're meaningful jobs. We care about our students, some of our colleagues, sometimes the wider goal, but that we can put down the laptop, not answer the email, take the alerts off, right? For whatever it is, whether it's the micro or macro aggressions or just the regular work of it. And I think that's part of the self-care, is not letting it become all consuming just because we have access all the time. So, I mean, I admire those people who say, I get up and work it like a 9 to 5. I'm like, I really don't. Like, I work it when the kid's asleep. I work it, you know, in between this or that, but I still say, and we're done, you know, at whatever point that is. And so I think that's a big part of, you know, saying it's not the most important thing, right?
Yeah, you know, yeah, I appreciate what you both are saying, and the notion that we can't balance, right? Even this false notion of multitasking, right? But let me ask this question. So maybe not thinking in terms of balance, but how do we maintain some semblance of self-care rather than letting our jobs, particularly in academia, just swallow up all of our time and and we end up in spaces where we just totally neglect the self, right? There's no walk, there's no walking, there's no meditation, there's none of that. So I've got to do these things because I see it happening to younger colleagues. I've got to do all these things, so I'm not going to go out, I'm not going to walk, I'm not going to breathe until I get this done, right? So how do we combat that? And I know it can be hard for any of us, right? There have been times, I think I don't do it regularly because I think I couldn't function, but there are still times where I got to do this. And even though I may be taking Saturdays off on a normal basis, but what about the times when I decide, and this is more often for some people where that time no longer exists for me. That day off no longer exists for me. Right? How do we not get to the point that we risk our health?
I think people in ministry and academia and mental health professionals, this is like a generational curse thing. I think that I liked what Dr. Sharp said earlier about that part of that introspection of self is learning to value yourself. And so when I get overscheduled, let me back up for a minute. I've already learned in my life to accept that I will never accomplish all the things I have on my plate. That's one thing. So that's not even my goal anymore. Sometimes what I used to do, which is when I realized I had to change this, I would have goals, and then if someone was in crisis, I would be angry that they were in crisis and take me away from my goal. I'm just being real transparent.
Yes.
But then I had to say, wait a minute. You are mad at someone for inconveniencing you because your work is more important than their crisis, because that's basically what that feeling says. And and the arrogance of that, I was like, who are you? And when I'm in crisis, do I want someone to feel that way about me? I don't. I want to be important enough and matter enough to you so that you would drop what you're doing. Not that I would ask you to do that a lot, but if I needed you, would you be there? Now, I was still there, but I also have to ask myself, am I really there fully present with them if I'm thinking in the back of my mind about all the stuff I'm not getting done? So one of the things I had to really learn to do was to let the spirit move. If someone calls me at 3 a.m. and they're in crisis, then that's what I'm supposed to be doing right now. Whatever I was doing before doesn't matter, because what I'm supposed to be doing right now is what I'm doing. I think for those of us who are parents, you really learn that. When your kids are sick, it does not matter in my world that a grant application is due. And I would be like, oh my God, because grant applications, they don't care why you're late. If you're not there at 5 o'clock for that deadline, then you just have to wait till the next cycle. That's it. They don't really want to hear about what happened. So I had to learn that when my kids were sick, then yeah, classes got canceled. People's therapy appointments got rescheduled because I needed to stop. And once I realized that the part of the problem was what I was defining as productivity. Was that really true? Like, was it really important that I finish that chapter or that article? Really, if I missed that deadline, then I just missed it. Like, what I always tell myself is like, I'm not curing cancer, so whatever I'm doing is not that, and it's not as important. The other thing though about the balance is that if I still have choices, and so part of whether or not I have balance in my life has to do with the choices I'm making. And if I'm so overwhelmed all the time, then I need to reevaluate the choices I'm making. Because I don't think we were created to be stressed. I don't. I think that there is inherent stress in the life we live and the world we live in, but we were not created to be stressful. And so when I find that I'm doing that, one is I'm not allowing the spirit to work, because I'm acting like all the work is on me and that the spirit has nothing to do with what I do, and it does. Those of us who've written sermons in Europe at the midnight hour, we all know, like, you're sitting there saying, I don't hear God saying nothing to me. I have learned to go to bed because sitting at my computer is not making God speak any louder. And so, but yet every Sunday morning at 11:30, my sermon's done. So hopefully it's done before then, but if it isn't and I don't hear anything, I relax, I go shopping, I go do something else, and God always speaks. So part of it is just learning to trust that and learning to trust yourself, that you do get stuff done, that there's never going to be a time where I have nothing on my plate, but I'm also not overwhelmed by that. I think that's just that I'm bivocational, so I'm not going to ever have nothing on my plate. And I learned to be comfortable and at peace with that. That's okay.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to say something before we close out? Yes, Dr. Shaw.
I love what everyone said. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm in this right now, and all of us in the academy are moving into online work in new ways. And so it is exhausting and a lot more work. So, and ministers are working more, not less, it seems to me, from the people I've talked with. Healthcare workers are working more, not less. So I think the system was already impossibly set up for well-being. I don't think I was in mind by the people who set up the system or any other women. And so just not caving into the system whenever possible is an act of resistance. And so where we can, trying to think about the people who are coming behind us and make systemic and policy changes so that this culture of exhaustion and productivity and always being on is just it's not healthy, and we know that, and then we're reviewed by unhealthy measures, and then we pass that on, and women can be just as bad at that as other people. So I try to have conversation partners, and see what can shift, what policy changes can be made. And we can do that in the classroom with our students too, right? So you can practice it at every level. And then the other thing that I really value is feedback. I think feedback can be so ugly and biting in the academy. And we have grades and all kinds of ways of evaluating each other, performance reviews and all these hierarchies in the academy, and in plenty of other institutions as well. And just being able to have conversation partners where I can say, how's this going? And get a response, and that response is not threatening, but a way for us to work together. So I'll send, or I'll put in the chat a resource that I've found really helpful for asking that question for feedback. Because if feedback can be non-threatening, then we can ask these harder questions about policy and the system and our practices, instead of just, you know, you did it right or you did it wrong. It's more, how can we live together a life of learning, which is what the academy should be, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Anybody else, any closing words before we close out? I want to invite you all to any resources you'd like to share, to put them in the chat box. I'm still working on this process of putting together lists of resources and how to get them to people who do register and so forth. So I thank you so much for your generosity and all that you have shared. I understand for Sam, it was Facebook Live. I just can't see it anymore from where I started. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I want to say the next, our next webinar is on healthfulness, transformation, and exercise. I think we have to learn to listen to our bodies, and those of us in our profession sit a lot. When I came here and went to a doctor and found out that I was borderline diabetic, for the first time in my life, my blood pressure was up for the first time in my life, that I took drastic changes. And she said, my doctor said, you must walk more than a half hour a day. And so, you know, I've committed to that. I've stopped eating ice cream. I feel so much better. Ice cream was my go-to self-medicating thing. So we have to know our voices, our bodies. Some stress is good, but not all stress. So we do need to take care of ourselves. Thank you so much, panelists, for all the wisdom you brought. I want to close with a womanist prayer. Yes, we'll be talking about yoga. Thank you, Dr. Molock. We'll be talking about yoga. 2 yoga specialists coming next week. Womanist prayer. I want to close with a womanist prayer. Dear Mother Goddess, divine, creator of the first garden of our mothers, we thank and praise you for planting the seeds from which our mothers imagined their own paradise. We are grateful for those who paved the way, and these women who shared today from the fruit of their gardens. We cherish what we have received today, and from those of yesterday, how they, the mothers and sisters before us and those in front of us today, survived the blight. You know, Goddess divine, that we were and are not meant to survive, let alone to thrive, but we can and we will because of wisdom, Sophia, Chokmah, and Chekimah. From the gardens, wisdom from the gardens that our mothers planted and nurtured. We are grateful for the teachers in our communities, for the psychologists, the pastoral care specialists, for their stories, their persistence, their will to know more than the oppressor. Determined is good for a girl to know, for Black and brown girls and their people to know. We will, Goddess divine, in our own womanist wisdom, knowledge, vulnerability, humility, determination, persistence, audacity, generosity, self-care, and that of our mothers, sisters, our allies, love ourselves and love each other. As neighbors, sister neighbors, in very particular ways, as well as communally. Show us how to help each other, Goddess divine, to survive and thrive. Let it be so, I say, and amen. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.